Well, welcome to the Cut for Time podcast here at the Canton United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Clay, joined by Eric Stearns, and today we're digging into our new message series based on the life of Joseph from the Old Testament, digging into some of the nitty-gritty details of Joseph's background and just kind of where this favoritism comes from, and then just kind of laying some groundwork as to why we're preaching this sermon series right now. Let's get into it.
Why this sermon series? Like what made you pick this one? What was the inspiration, I guess?
Yeah. So I kind of have inadvertently created a pattern where in the fall we start to dig into one character of the Bible. 2 years ago was the Apostle Paul. We did the series on Paul and his life and ministry and responding to the call of God. And then we talked about Peter being the flawed and faithful disciple last year. And so I was just like, well, we've kind of started in this trajectory of going through like a real character study in the fall. And I was like, we haven't really preached out of the Old Testament a whole lot over the last little bit. And so, yeah, let's do an Old Testament character. And just like the reason why I settled on Joseph is because he does live a life with integrity. And he does live this life where he is challenged every single way that you can think of. You know, he is tempted by power. I mean, he is in this family, like in God's chosen family. Like this is the promised people of God. Like he is a descendant of Abraham. He is one through whom the promises of God are going to be fulfilled. He's the favorite son. And like that could have led to him being cocky and, self-centered and arrogant and, fill in all the negative adjectives that you want to, but it didn't. The commentaries that I read this week made it clear that there was no malintent in him sharing his dreams with his brothers. It was him just talking. It was him just sharing, him just like thinking, wow, how cool is this? He wasn't trying to like set himself as above his station. He wasn't trying to set himself above his brothers. He just had this thing happening in his life and he wanted to talk to somebody about it. Like he's maintained this humility, even though he's being told these conflicting messages of his greatness by the dreams and by God and even his father a little bit. He's being told this, this counter message by his brothers about how awful he is and how how much he's, annoying to them and just, he's terrible and awful. What do you do with that? What do you do with the wild dream that God gives you? But then it doesn't come true for Joseph. It was 20 years. All told, between his initial dreamings at age 17 and his rise to power in Egypt, it's 20 years. And in those 20 years, he's beaten and left for dead. He's sold into slavery. He's falsely accused of rape. He's, there's just all this stuff that happens, but he maintains his integrity in the midst of all of it. And so now we are called to lead these Christian lives, and life can be just as weird for us as it was for Joseph. Like, I hope that we never go through half of what Joseph goes through, but yet the question remains for us, how do we live? How do we live with integrity? And then at the end of the story, the punchline of the entire story is that Joseph is in Egypt, leading them to economic success. They have enough food, not just for themselves, but for the entire region, because from Canaan, here come these starving boys. I'm just like, oh my gosh, you guys have food. Can you please help us? And it's the brothers, and like Joseph reveals himself and, the brothers are like, oh crap. We thought he was dead. We thought we sold him to the Ishmaelites. We thought, and now here he has all this power. We're going to get creamed. And we're going to deserve it, but we're going to get creamed. And Joseph's like, no, that's not how it's going to be. Like, he shows such a measure of grace that I find hard to attain. I mean, when someone does something wrong to me, I want to like drive it home. I want them to know that they've wronged me, and I want them to know, and I want it to hurt. But Joseph doesn't do that. Joseph does not take that tack. Joseph says, what you all intended for evil, God has used for good, and forgives his brothers, and they all live happily ever after until, generations later when Israel falls into slavery. Details. But throughout Joseph's entire life, he lived with this absurd integrity and he lived with this grace, and he lived with this conviction for so long. I mean, he had these dreams when he was a kid, and then not until he's, a very adulty adult do these things start to come to pass and come to fruition. And a lot, like I said, a lot of stuff happens between then and there. But he holds on to the idea of the dreams. He holds on to the notion that God's working in and through him. And I'm way faster to throw in the towel than he is. If I have this wild God dream and it doesn't like just happen, I'm like, okay, cool. God didn't want that instead. My bad. Like maybe I'm the one that's wrong, and I'm just I'm willing to just, lay it aside. But how do we hold on to that spark too? So I think that this story answers a lot of questions that we're asking right now. And so wanted to dig into it.
Mm-hmm. It's good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, as you were going through that, or even as I was re-listening to it this morning, I thought about how can I influence my kids as they have these big dreams? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, not saying that I don't have dreams, because I do, and things that I'm working towards and trying to attain.
Right.
But I can work towards that, but I have a really strong influence on what my kids are going to, and I can support them. Mm-hmm. It's trying to teach them that, yes, go chase those dreams that you have. Teach them to be, productive dreams. You don't want them chasing something that's not productive and help the world, but to guide them and to not, treat people poorly in order to get the things that you want. And I can, as a parent, I can point to Joseph and say, hey, look at this example of a guy who just got crapped on his whole life, but had this dream and kept working towards it, knowing that someday it was going to come true.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And not to just, we can't just throw stones at Jacob, but, we can also look to him as an example of how not to do some stuff too.
Exactly.
The father in the story is not necessarily the father that we want to talk about.
Or that we want to be.
Yeah. If we see a dynamic starting to form, I think that's our job as parents to squash that rather than to exacerbate it. If we really ever got into onto why Joseph is the favorite, because then there is a definitive reason as to why he's the favorite. Mm-hmm. And the way that the Good News Translation put it is kind of that idea of glossing over that we talked about, like the VeggieTales version. There's some nitty gritty details that the Bible definitely left out of that story. And the reason why Joseph is the favorite of the 12 sons of Jacob is because of who his mom is. Back in Genesis 29, Jacob meets Rachel and is immediately smitten by her. They have this meet cute moment where they find, where Jacob comes to her area, and meets Rachel, and he is just instantly in love with her. And, starts to work for Rachel's dad, Laban. And Laban's like, well, you're working for me. What do you want for working for me? And Jacob's like, well, I want your daughter Rachel's hand in marriage. The problem is that Rachel's the younger daughter, and that's not how it works. Usually in our day and age, it doesn't matter nearly as much. But in that day and age, the older daughter got married first. That's how it worked. You don't marry off the younger daughter. But Rachel was the younger daughter and had an older sister named Leah. And so Laban hatches this plan 7 years earlier and says, hey, if you work for me for 7 years, you can have my daughter's hand in marriage. Notice that he doesn't specify which daughter. You can have my daughter's hand in marriage. And so after 7 years of working for Laban, it comes time for wedding time. And really it comes time for consummation time, because that's how Jewish families work. And it ends up being Leah in the tent. And so he ends up married to Leah, and he's just like, what now? Jacob worked for 7 years to marry Rachel. He is in love with Rachel. He's been in love with Rachel this entire time, and now he's married to Leah. And Laban's like, well, the older daughter gets married first. That's how it works. Work for me for another week, and you can marry my daughter Rachel. And so he marries Rachel, and then he goes on to work for Laban for 7 more years. So he worked for 14 years for Laban on his farm and married both of his daughters. And so and both of those daughters had other female helpers, Bilpah and Zilpah. And so all these 12 sons came from the 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah, and then also Bilpah and Zilpah, the assistants of the 2 daughters. And so because Jacob was so in love with Rachel, and Rachel bore him Joseph becomes the favorite.
So is Joseph the only child of Rachel?
No, Benjamin, the youngest, is also the son of Rachel. But because Joseph is the older brother of the beloved wife, he's the favorite. So yeah, it's tricky and it's messy and it's really, really I don't know. It almost feels like biblical gossip, because it's
it totally is.
Yeah, it's who's sleeping with who, and it comes down to motherhood, and to hear it in the Good News translation of, oh well, Joseph's the favorite because he was born in Jacob's old age. No. That has nothing to do with it. It has everything to do with it being the favorite wife. So,
first of all, this may or may not be for the podcast, but
first of all,
wives, that's just stressful. That's way too much work.
Yeah.
But in a serious note, called to marry, I mean, the idea of polygamy and concubines, right? As Christians, where does that switch for us? Where, I mean, is it just societal that we're no, that's not what we do? Or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And not at all where I thought the podcast was going to go, and that's just fine. Sure. That's why we're here. Mm-hmm. I think it was societal. I think that monogamy became kind of more understood as the norm of things. I mean, Jesus never really addresses it, other than to say, if you are lusting after somebody that is not someone that you're supposed to be lusting after, you need to shut that down. You need to control yourself. If you can't control yourself, cut your hand off, because if you fall into sexual sin, it's better to walk around life with one hand than to not, than to fall into sin, or it's better to pluck your eye out than to fall into sin. And so that's really the only real time that gets addressed is Jesus making this claim, this way of reinterpreting society that Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount, which is where that comes from. But yeah, I think it was more just kind of society moved on. The need to populate the earth became less, and I just think that that's my understanding.
Yikes! Ugh.
Yeah, right.
That seems stressful and way too much work.
Yeah. Yep.
It's 2 married men talking about this. I can't imagine having more than one wife. I love mine, but I don't want to.
Yeah. Yes. That's TWO, not, I don't want to love my wife. You're right. It's just, let's just,
Very true.
Yeah. Let's specify, because podcast. So
numeral 2, not
also.
Yes,
I do not want to WO. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting that it was the favorite wife's oldest son.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
obviously didn't dislike his other wife too much for having that many children with all these other people.
Right.
Which
Yeah. I mean,
once again is just kind of an interesting societal thing that
mhm.
men
Yeah.
and were definitely treated much differently than they are now.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
definitely.
in the Western in our Western society anyway.
Yeah, I mean, women were I mean, they were just above property. I mean, it was not, and like that's, the women that you love were just above property, like concubines and servants and everything like that, also like that. That was just a possession that
Yeah.
you used, and yeah, it was a resource.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really unfortunate way that the world worked. And I'm glad that we've moved forward into progress, but we can't. That I mean, talking about heroes of the Bible and the warts and all of it all. This is part of the warts of all. Warts of it all is just the role of women and how that has been turned and twisted and yeah throughout time.
Right. Well, and it's something it's like you said, it's warts that we have to deal with, and we have to be okay with
Mm-hmm.
them doing things that we don't agree with.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's why. I mean, that's just another example of Jesus turning things on its head completely. Of Jesus is really. I mean, when you look at the way that Jesus interacted with women, I mean, that was scandalous, and he just didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
John 4, the story of the woman at the well, like, she straight up calls him out, and he's just like, why are you, a Jewish man, talking to me, a Samaritan woman? Like, first of all, Jews and Samaritans, that's drama. And then also, you're a man and I'm a woman, and this is not a conversation that we should be having. Like this, that we should not be talking. Why are you talking to me? Why are you continuing to talk to me? And Jesus treats her with such dignity, and like to the point where she can't help but go and proclaim Jesus to her community. Like that, just and the way that Jesus healed. Like I think of the woman that had the bleeding disorder. Like she's been dealing with this disorder for years and years and years, and Jesus just with such grace, who touched me in the crowd, and just the disciples are like, we can't possibly know who touched you, but the woman knew that Jesus was looking for her and stood up, and Jesus said, okay, cool, well, you are healed because of your faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's another great example of treating those around us that are considered unequal as equals.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like though how you open this sermon with talking about David and Jonah and those that have issues.
Yes.
That we still have to be okay with those issues and understand who they were as heroes in the Bible. Because I still struggle with David, to be completely honest.
Fair.
Like all the crap that he did, I'm like, man,
Yep. Yeah.
Killing his best friend to steal his wife and just.
Yep. To the point that it takes a prophet, like, telling you a parable to be like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and just, yeah, that whole story is so messed up.
Right.
Yep. But it just shows you the power of human greed and, absolute power corrupting. He was the king and the greatest king, and people just fawned over him, and he thought he could do anything he wanted to and did, and then found out that he could not.
So. Right. But that's the ultimate power of God too. Like he can take those people, the people who do really, really terrible things, and use them for amazing things.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and like that's why Joseph is so different, and like that's why I named this sermon series "A Life of Character and Grace," because he does live with character and with integrity throughout the entirety of his story. Like I said on Sunday, if there are warts to Joseph's story, it is in his social unawareness. Like he's trying to. I mean, I don't think that there was malice or bad intention when he's just like, "Hey guys, I had this dream and it's so crazy. I want y'all to know about it." Read the room, buddy. Like.
Mm-hmm.
this is not going to go well. And then he has another dream and he's just like, guys, guess what? All these stars and the sun and the moon bowed to me. And they're just like, no, thank you. And, if that's the biggest wart in his story, which we're going to find out basically is still a pretty good example for us to follow.
Right. He had definitely had a very punchable face.
Oh, yeah. Had to have.
Story,
had to have had a very punchable face. Yes.
Oh.
We'll get there. It's next week. So. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I can't imagine brothers and being not necessarily. I mean, it would be demeaning listening to that and his dad listening to that and being told that you're less than by your little brother. I mean, I'm an older brother, and so thankfully he hasn't done that to me. So except for as kids, because who doesn't as 4 brothers growing up? But
right, yeah, yep. But yeah, I mean, it would be the same as Jared coming and saying, these crazy wild things to you, or really with the birth order, it'd be like you going to John and Brian and saying these crazy wild things, and then just seeing what happened next. And just I don't think that would go well for anybody. And like one of the things that the commentaries I read this week made clear is just like, there's no bad intention here. There's no, he's not trying to rub it in their faces, but he ends up rubbing it in their faces. And no matter what his intentions were, that's what happened. And that's how it was received. And he just didn't, he didn't get it. And then more dangerously, Jacob didn't get it, he could be, after the second dream, he did pull his son aside and chastise him and say, hey, do you really think that this is going to come true? Do you really think that this is what God's doing? And also tone it down, man. And but the damage was already done, as we're going to see, like I said, as we're going to see next week, as the story continues to unfold, we're going to get into what happens when the brothers got sick of Joseph. So.
Sure. So you kind of introduced Joseph this week. Kind of gave us a little bit of the background. What does next week look like?
Yeah, so next week we're going to be moving forward to the next scene in the story. We're going to be picking up right where we left off in Scripture. Jacob sends his brothers out to watch the flock, keeps Joseph with him. Maybe looks like he's trying to protect him, but not really, because then he sends Joseph out there by himself to go and make sure that his brothers are doing what they're supposed to do. He's going to be in that role of the snitch that he was again earlier, but this time the brothers have had enough of it. The brothers band together and they say, look at the dreamer, and proving that sarcasm is as old as the Bible itself. Look at that dreamer, and then they decide to kill him. And then the oldest brother, Reuben, steps in and says, okay, let's not kill him, but let's beat him up a little bit, let's rough him up. And they end up roughing him up, throwing him in a pit or a cistern. And then they get another idea of selling him to some Ishmaelites that are passing by. And that's really the bridge from how he gets from Canaan to Egypt, is these Ishmaelites take him and then they sell him to Potiphar, who he ends up working for, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks. But this is the story of the brothers desiring to shatter the dreams of Joseph, desiring for these dreams to stop happening by making sure that Joseph doesn't dream anymore by killing him. Until they're, distracted by their own greed. So we're going to be digging into we've probably never been through something like that, I hope, a lot of us, but yet we've been through, we've had ideas and we've had dreams and we've had this understanding of where God's leading us, but it doesn't work out. Something happens, there's forces that work against us. How do we hold on to God's call in our lives when things are that crazy? Or how do we hold on to our faith in God when life is that crazy? There's a psalm that talks about the wicked are prospering and everything's upside down and life doesn't make a lot of sense. God, where are you in the midst of all of this? Joseph would be having those same feelings, those same impressions. Like, the brothers are having their way with life right now. They're doing whatever they want to. They're beating me. They've beat me and left me for dead. Where's God in the midst of all of that? How do we hold on to our faithfulness when life feels so disordered? So that'll be kind of where we spend our time focusing on Sunday.
So I think everyone has those thoughts, those struggles. Well, thanks for joining us this week's Cut for Time podcast. Join us again next week in church in person at 10 a.m., online, or for the podcast next week.
Thanks for listening to our Cut for Time conversation. Join us for worship in person or on Facebook Live Sundays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And now go in peace and serve the Lord.